Howdy, SAINTCON. How's it going? This is a sucky time slot. The 2 o'clock drowsies have all set in, right? I'm feeling it. Lunch is hitting me hard. Let's see if we can wake some people up here.
You need a horse simulator?
What's that?
You need a horse simulator?
Yeah, that might help. My name is Trevor O'Donnell. I work for Rapid7 as a technical lead and a red teamer. And this is my favorite avatar because it shows the two sides of me. I'm a cowboy, I'm from Texas, and I'm a hacker. And yes, I was actually hacking something while I was sitting on the horse when this picture was taken. My wife took it. And I'm not just a fake cowboy, I actually do my own foaling and everything. This was a great experience for me and my kids. For those of you who prefer a more professional headshot, there you go. For the nerds out there you go. And for you government types, there's my passport photo. All right, why should you listen to what I have to say here today? I've been doing offensive security since 1995. That's 28 years of attacking networks, attacking systems, and finding ways to get in. Red team specific for the last 4 years. I've had plenty of blue team experience, so I've seen both sides of this war, back and forth. I've messed up 1,000 times, and I've had to fix those mess ups every time. So I've got a little experience here. So what I wanted to talk about today was this ongoing arms race between red versus blue. Red teams versus blue teams, hackers versus defenders. I'm in a position where I've been doing this for a long time, and so I've been able to watch this evolution of the battle for quite a while, from the earliest forms of antivirus all the way up to today. And I've seen some interesting things, but there's some interesting takeaways from it too. Here's the agenda. It's one of those obligatory slides. I'm not going to go through it. If you don't know what we talk about by the time we're done, I didn't do it right. All right, who here is a battle-hardened Halo veteran? All right, there's a few of you out there. Familiar with the red versus blue series? This is where this whole red team versus blue team came up from. Blue team, their responsibility is to defend the network, the data, and the assets, prepare those defenses, set up detection infrastructure, monitor for alerts, and triage incidents, and then go threat hunting to find the culprit. If you look at this from a militaristic point of view, a lot of times when you say blue team, everybody thinks about those guys in the SOC, right? In reality, the blue team makes up the engineers that design the systems, the developers that develop the software that drive those systems, and the SOC. So the preparing of the defenses, those are your engineers. The setting up the detection infrastructure also involves engineers and probably some developers. Monitoring the alerts, triaging, and threat hunting, there's your SOC guys. And they all act like members of the military. You got your foot soldiers, your infantry, you've got your radar guys that are looking for the threats out there, and everything in between. They need to be able to take decisive remedial action to kill the threat. Now the red team are the bad guys, right? Our responsibility is to try to gain access to the data and the assets, avoid detection at all costs, because if you get detected, you get hunted. We don't want to be hunted. Spread our influence through the network as much as possible without getting caught. Set up persistence, so in case something we did over here gets caught and shut down, we can get back in. And to use any means at our disposal. That means if I can break into your building, I'm going to break into your building, and I'm going to put something on your network. If I can get through your wireless, I'm going to connect through your wireless. Whatever it takes for me to get in, phishing, vishing, you name it. So what is a red team as far as an engagement type? We're just building up this foundation of knowledge, so when we start talking about this arms race, it makes sense. The main focus of a red team engagement are what we call an adversary simulation. is our job is to test the detection and response capabilities of the client. See how well their setup allows them to see what's going on maliciously on their network. And the methodology we use is, number one, stealth. Our main focus is stealth, trying to be as quiet as possible. Our goal is to get as much control as possible without getting caught, and of course, loot. And whereas a penetration test is a very different animal. Penetration test is meant to find as many vulnerabilities as possible in a certain amount of time. There's no attempt at stealth, not trying to evade any detection. We're just throwing stuff at it as fast as we can, find as many vulnerabilities and chains of attack as possible. So there's no desire to hide. Usually everybody in the company knows it's coming, whereas on a red team, in some cases, they may never know we're coming except for maybe one guy on the client side. And if we're good, if we do it right, they might never know we were there until the report comes out. Here is what we call a command and control system for a red team. This is a typical command and control system we use. On the right, you see the client network, the victim network. You see one host there that has been infected with an implant. And we get those implants. We're going to talk about how we get those implants on those hosts. But the main idea is to have that implant communicating outbound to bypass firewalls and other network detections. And then we use redirectors out on the internet as the primary communication and connection point for those implants, so that if the blue team detects an implant, triages it, analyzes it, and figures out what address or domain it's going to, and they block that, I can very quickly swap that domain to point to the address of a different redirector and regain my control of that host if they haven't removed the implant. And we usually will have a long haul and short haul set of redirectors. So 2 redirectors for long haul, 2 redirectors for short haul. Long haul, we'll put an implant in and we won't touch that box for a while. We'll just let that sit there, get control of another box and use that as our short haul box, which we will then do most of our work through as we're trying to hack into more things in the network. So if it gets caught, we still have another implant they don't know about. That's our persistence. Our main framework that we use most of the time is Covenant. Anybody heard of that? Covenant C2, open source C2 framework. It's really nice. It's got little bugs, and there's always going to be something that some people hate, some people love. We also use Mythic. We're actually working a lot on developing our own agent setup for Mythic, so it'll be fully customized to just what we do. That helps against signature detection that we'll talk about later. But let's talk about payload delivery systems. When we're talking about payloads, which is really what we're going to talk a lot about today, this is an F-35. Anybody know much about an F-35? Very expensive. It's the most sophisticated stealth fighter in the world. We can consider the F-35 the delivery system of the payload. The F-35 carries the ammunition into the battle zone and releases it. Our payload delivery systems are phishing, vishing, maybe a USB drop, maybe mouse jacking. Anybody familiar with mouse jacking? Mouse jacking's fun, I love it. Or maybe even Dropbox. If I just get access to your building, I'm going to go find a hidden jack somewhere under a cubicle behind a garbage can. I'm going to stick my little Raspberry Pi that has a full copy of Kali Linux on it, plug it into the jack. It connects back out to my server at the hotel. I want to go back to the hotel, turn on TV, and hack from my hotel where I can't be seen. Now, Dropbox is kind of its own payload, but the other 4 require some kind of payload to be put in that delivery system. Droppers are analogous to like the cruise missile that the F-35 launches. The dropper is what takes that payload and moves it into the host. Common droppers that we use, you might be familiar with, Office documents with the macro. A lot harder to use now. There's a lot of detections around that. HTML applications we use a lot. HTA files. You can make it look like a document, like an electronic document, a form of some kind. Get a good pretext. You tell the victim, hey, we need you to do your management effectiveness survey to rate your manager. Fill out this electronic form. When they open that form, they don't even have to submit it. All they have to do is open it. There's code built in and embedded into that application on the background that then drops the implant, the payload, onto the host and executes it. It's just a simple installer script. We use this a lot for Mac OS. Using OSA script and Apple script language, we can write a script that will then write the payload to the disk and launch it, create a launch agent so it relaunches every time you boot up, and bypass the gatekeeper. We're going to talk about that later in the talk. Or just getting them to download an executable. You'd be surprised how often we can get people to do that. And then there's the warhead, not that warhead, that warhead. The warhead is the actual payload itself. That's the part inside the cruise missile that does the thing. That might just be something as simple as a keystroke script, something that just tells the system to pull the Wi-Fi password out of memory and send it back to me so that I can then log on to the Wi-Fi and come through another attack vector. It could be something like just a small targeted executable that just does a few basic things just to get me that initial foothold, and then I can stage more sophisticated payloads later. Or it might be a fully advanced command and control client like Covenant and Mythic use. In Covenant, it's called a grunt. So we're going to talk about payload development. It can get this complicated. We have to take into consideration stealth. The payload has to be developed in such a way that it's difficult, if not impossible, to detect. Otherwise, I'm dead in the water from the start. I don't get any control at all. But it also has to have the right functionality. What is it that I plan to do once I get control of that network? And is that functionality built into my payload? Customizability is a big deal. And this is one of the reasons why we use Mythic and Covenant. Covenant is based on C#. Mythic can be written in several different languages you can write your agents in. And the reason we use that is because I have the source code right there, and I can modify that source code to fit my needs and customize it to my desires. And one of the reasons we want to customize, and we're going to talk about a lot here, is to aid with the stealth. We'll talk about how AV works. Size is a huge consideration. The exploit that I'm going to use to get that payload injected in memory or to execute or whatever is going to have a specific space allotment. And if my payload doesn't fit, if the shell code doesn't fit in that space, it's not going to run. So my delivery method, my dropper, the exploit, all that comes into consideration as I build my payload and select my payload, because it's going to determine how big it can be. If it's a very small amount of space, then what my payload's going to be is a first stage, and all that first stage does is reach out to another system that I control, grab the actual implant, download it across the internet, and then launch it. Is it staged or stageless? And that's what we're just talking about. A staged payload is one that has a minimal size stager that then downloads the payload and launches it, whereas a stageless, everything's contained in that one payload that the dropper puts on the system. And there are detection considerations on both of those. My attack path is going to make a big difference in how I design my payload and the dropper. If I'm using a phishing attack to try and gain control, I'm going to want to use something like an HTA document or a Word document with a macro or something like that. And it all depends on what kind of detection or protections my client has. And this is our biggest problem. For gaining our initial foothold, this is the one thing that we fight against constantly, and this is where the arms race that I'm going to be talking about comes from. Everything from antivirus to advanced endpoint protection systems, we're constantly coming up against them. And we have the ones we hate the most. There's one vendor in particular, I'm not going to name names, that I happen to know they have an actual code name just for the Rapid7 Red team, because we have a very specific way of doing things and they're familiar with some of the stuff we try, and we are locked in a constant arms race. We get past their latest stuff, they figure out what we did, and then the next time I go to do a red team, they're detecting that and I've got to find something else to do. And they get really frustrated and upset, but one of these days I'm going to run into one of them at DEF CON, I got to buy them a beer or something and say, you guys are good adversaries. We enjoy coming up against you. There's a new one that we've been running up against lately that's been extremely difficult. I won't mention them either. So what I'm going to talk about now, the rest of the talk is going to be what I call a somewhat accurate history of the arms race. I say somewhat accurate because this is based on my observations and my experience as I've been doing this kind of thing, and others may have experienced it a little differently. But in general, the principles are the same. So in the beginning, hackers created viruses. Back then, we call them, there was a virus, there was a worm, there was a rootkit, there was a Trojan, all kinds of different names, and there was lots of debate that went on about which one was which. And, oh, it does this, so it must be a worm, but it also does this, so it could be a rootkit, and lots of debate. Now we just call it malware. I think everybody got tired of the debate. And so early on, anybody remember FPROT? Anybody hear that old? There's a few out there. There were boot viruses that would start at boot up before the operating system even loaded. And so you had these antivirus programs that would run a full scan of the hard drive at boot up before Windows would even load. And you had to sit there and wait for all the files to get scanned. And those earliest versions of antivirus, they did their detection using signatures. And basically that's just either like a hash of a known malware file or some specific binary pattern or assembly pattern that malware is known to use. And so they would when they find a malware in the wild, they would analyze it in the lab and figure out, hey, this always shows up. Whenever we get this virus, this particular pattern is always there. And they would create a signature for that piece of malware. And that's when you get alerts to this day that pop up from a detection from Defender or something, and it gives a specific code name for that malware, that's usually a signature detection. So that was the earliest form of anti-malware. They check the downloaded files, they check any files written to disk, see if any of them match what's in that database, and if it does, they'll alert the user. Hopefully they'll quarantine or delete the file and halt its execution. Sometimes some of the more advanced ones at the time would send it to an actual lab for further analysis, especially if it was something that they hadn't seen before. They might create new, or if it was a new version of that malware, they'll add more signatures. And so the shields were holding for a while. They were able to stem the tide a little bit. People who didn't spend the money for the antivirus, they were out of luck. And they would have all kinds of problems. So Red Team came up with a counterattack, and that was custom malware. If you want to avoid being detected by a signature, you write a new piece of malware that doesn't match any of those signatures. Problem is, that takes a lot of time and a lot of development. Became a big, heavy level of effort. And it's time consuming, so what we decided to do is we built these tools called confusers. A confuser basically takes that compiled malware and then just mixes up, it changes all of the method names, rearranges things, it adds in code that will prevent it from being run in a sandbox, in a VM, all kinds of different things, to where the antivirus doesn't even recognize it. Even though it's exactly the same as the one you used last week, every time you run it through the confuser, it comes out a different binary. That worked for a while. In fact, I think we went for a good year and a half using the same confuser tool with impunity, just bypassing antivirus like crazy. Drove our clients nuts. And so Blue Team decided to get smart, and they initiated entropy checks, because when you run a confuser on a piece of malware, it changes the entropy pattern of that binary representation of the file, and it doesn't look as random or as ordered as it would normally be if it was a piece of code, an application written by a trusted developer. It looks more random and more garbaged up. And they check the entropy and see how random it looks, compare that to what they consider a normal threshold, and if it doesn't match that threshold, if it goes beyond that threshold, it gets flagged for further analysis. Sometimes it might block it, sometimes it might not. It depends on the vendor. And we're going to see this later on. I'm going to do a demo, and you're going to see how a particular version of an implant that I run against a particular antivirus software, it's going to detect it, but allow it to continue executing. Which is not really great, but using this kind of detection, you're not 100% sure this is a malicious file. And so you flag it suspicious, you send it into the lab for analysis, but you gotta kind of let it run so you're not causing disruption. Might send an alert to the user, might not. So red team counterattacks with what we call the AMSI and ETW bypass. Anybody know what AMSI is? Anybody heard of it? AMSI stands for the Anti-Malware Scan Interface. It's a Windows API that allows developers of applications, good applications, to interface through this AMSI API and talk to whatever anti-malware system is installed on that host. It could be any vendor, because the antivirus software talks to that same interface. And so it acts as an intermediary that obfuscates away which version of whose software it is versus which antivirus software, and they can communicate and the scanning can happen. ETW is event tracking for Windows, which allows developers to develop their apps to send logging into the Windows event logging system so that those logs can be analyzed by endpoint protections and looked for suspicious activity. So the problem with AMSI and ETW is they are opt-in, which is kind of odd for a security tool. If I am the developer, which I am when I'm building the payload, I just put in a bypass to skip AMSI and ETW altogether, and it doesn't get looked at. It's a Jedi mind trick. We call it AMSI patching. So that worked great for about 6 months. We're having a heyday again. Until some of the more advanced EDR vendors came up with a signature for AMSI bypass techniques. They said, oh, I see what they're doing. There's specific code that you have to write to those interfaces, those APIs, to bypass AMSI and ETW. And there's very little variation in the code to do that. And so they wrote a signature to detect, is this binary trying to bypass AMSI or ETW? If it is, it's probably suspicious, and it would get flagged. So that kind of killed that. But they didn't really know for sure, is this file malware or not? And hence the, I don't know who you are, but I will find you. So they create the signature. If it detects it, it might block execution, it might delete or quarantine the file, and it might alert the user. Sometimes it might not. It may just send the sample to the lab for investigation. It depends on the vendor. So we were pretty ticked off that our AMSI bypass wasn't working anymore. So we said, all right, they're detecting this using signatures. So what we're going to do is we're going to write this really long function that basically has an encoded version of the AMSI bypass in it. And so when you look at the code in memory, it doesn't look anything like an AMSI bypass because the AMSI bypass doesn't exist until execution time. And then the bypass is decoded out of the source code and run in memory. That was great. So we just wrote it differently, encoded it into the payload, and they saw nothing. So, blue team's response. And this was a big, huge evolutionary step in EDR. Userland hooking kicked our butts for a while. Userland hooking is when you install the EDR on the host. Every executable, every process that starts on that host, before it's allowed to execute beyond a certain point, the antivirus or EDR system will stick a software hook into that process's memory space so that any time it accesses a specific API in NTDLL, every Windows application makes calls to NTDLL. Specific calls like NTOpen process, allocate virtual memory, write virtual memory, protect virtual memory, and create a thread. This is this same process when we're injecting code into memory to execute a malicious thread. We follow these calls in that order. And so they would hook these hooks into the process, and if it saw us making these calls, it would say, nope, shut that thing down, it's bad, kill it, get rid of it. And that was hard for us to get by for a while. And it took every security researching firm that did red team operations in the country, and probably across the world, was digging into this and in their research labs, and they were trying to pick apart how this hooking works and how can we get past it. So that kind of acts as a tripwire. So if we come in with our malware, even if we bypass anti-phishing detection, if we bypass the AV scanner, the signature detection, we bypass the AMSI bypass detection, and we get to where we're ready to inject our payload into memory, and it sees us do those functions, it's a tripwire, we're toast. So we eventually figured out, well, they can't, all they can do is look at DLL calls. We just won't make any. We'll just make a direct syscall to the kernel. Now, this works really, really well. The problem is, it takes a significant amount of coding. In C and C++, it's bad enough. But when you're trying to port kernel calls, syscalls into C#, it takes twice as much code because you have to make delegates into the kernel code, and then you've got to do marshalling and all that stuff. It really increases the size of your payload, which then limits your delivery capabilities. But it works really well. The advantage is you are virtually invisible to antivirus and EDR, unless it does behavioral analysis. The most sophisticated EDR systems out there, enterprise level, do all of this. They do signature detection. They look for AMSI bypasses. They do userland hooking, and they do sandboxing behavioral analysis. And sandboxing is basically they detonate the payload in maybe a VM, maybe just a memory space, and they analyze what it does. What DLLs does it load? Does it load NTDLL? Does it make any calls to NTDLL? If it doesn't, that's weird. It should be making calls to NTDLL. And so if it's not, but it's executing new threads, that's definitely a sign this is something malicious. Does the code write to memory, and the code written to memory, does that code match any signatures? So there's almost a double level of signature detection there. And since the payload code doesn't appear in the file and disk, because we've encoded it or whatever, it does eventually at some point when it gets injected in memory to be executed, it does have to be in an unencoded state. And if they're doing this kind of sandboxing behavioral analysis, they can catch that memory segment and then run it against the signature check. Does it do anything suspicious? Is it sending constant broadcasts out to a web address? Why is it doing that? Where is it going? And is that a known malicious domain that it's going to? Checks all that stuff and then some. So that brings us to the latest hotness. App domain injection. Anybody ever heard of App Domain Manager? I'm not seeing any hands. This is a .NET thing. So .NET has this concept called app domains, where if the developer wants to, in addition to the main line of code that executes when you run the application, he can create multiple app domains that load additional code in isolated segments of the process. And it's isolated from other processes in that process. And so you can have multiple things going on, almost like multi-threading, but those threads can't talk to each other without marshalling. And so there's no cross isolation activity. So although the main application thread is being looked at heavily by antivirus and EDR, this isolated app domain over here that executed our payload isn't getting looked at all. Here's how app domain injection works. Ironically, it was meant to provide more security. What it ended up doing is giving us a nice method to execute our payloads. We talked about this. This is all configurable by the developer. And the way it's configurable by the developer means it can be configurable by the attacker as well. All you need is an app domain manager configuration file, any .NET application, and a malicious DLL that holds your payload and the dropper. The config file sets up the new app domain. When the target application executes, it sees the config file. The config file says, hey, create a new app domain called this, and then load this DLL over here into its memory space and execute it. So the cool thing is, the library is loaded in an isolated environment, but there are a lot of Windows system binaries that are .NET based. So putting on your black hat, you're thinking about this. .NET has a way for isolated code that's not the main application to be loaded into memory and executed, and there are Windows system binaries that are .NET. The light bulb went on. If an attacker can write an app domain config file and a malicious DLL to the target host in some way, they can execute malicious code in the trusted context of a trusted binary. And the EDR says, that's a signed Windows binary. We know that's part of Windows. Don't bother it. All the while, there's a malicious payload running in the background. It still works. We've been using this since 2021, and it still gets us past some of the most advanced EDR systems out there. Here's an attack scenario. We create the app domain configuration file. We pick a Windows system.NET binary that we want to take advantage of. In the demo that we're going to do today, the binary we're going to go after is SQL log ship. It's a Windows binary meant to ship SQL logs to a logging server. It comes on every copy of Windows. It's in the System32 folder. It's .NET, and you can do app domain injection on it. So we write our little app domain configuration file. It's about 10 lines long. We create a malicious DLL that contains the dropper for our payload, and we compile that DLL. We copy the config file and the DLL, and a copy of SQL logship.exe, or whichever binary you chose to use, off of my Windows system. I can copy that, and I'll put them all into an ISO image. And the reason we pick ISO image is because it's the one archive that Windows still doesn't alert on or give nasty pop-ups when you try to mount it. It's nice and easy, and it's really easy for a user to just double-click it. It opens it up, they see some files, they run the one they're supposed to run, boom, they're infected. So then we use a vishing or a phishing attack, some kind of pretext to get them to download, mount that image, and execute the trusted Windows application. Antivirus comes along, looks at it, says, oh, that's SQL logship.exe. That's trusted. It's signed by Windows, the signature matches, checks out, move on. This is not the droid you're looking for. Another attack we use a lot right now that's similar to app domain injection is DLL sideloading. You may be familiar with this in another context, which is privilege escalation on a Windows system. We use DLL sideloading in that context to get a system program to launch our malware as a side DLL. And this is how it works. You find an application that imports a DLL, but it doesn't use any of the functions in that DLL. You'd be surprised how often this happens. How many applications import a DLL but never use any of the functions in that DLL. It's blown my mind at how many do that. So if it never uses anything in that DLL, I can overwrite that DLL with my DLL with the same name, and no errors are going to pop up because it's never going to say, oh, that function doesn't exist, because it never uses any functions out of that DLL. Or I can find an application that loads a DLL, but it only uses one or two of the functions in that DLL. And my DLL that I write can contain proxies to that DLL. I rename the original DLL to something else, and I write code in my DLL that says, if you receive a call for this function, go to this DLL and run the function from that DLL. Otherwise, do this. So then the attack would overwrite or rename the original DLL, replace it with a malicious DLL, and then any time that trusted application is launched, my DLL gets run too, and I get another callback from my payload. Here's the attack scenario. I identify a target application that has a DLL it doesn't call any functions from, or just a couple. I create my DLL that sideloads. And oftentimes during the OSINT phase of the engagement, the recon phase, I can figure out, hey, these guys use Teams, or these guys use this or that, or whatever applications they use. And you can find that in all kinds of places, like employment listings for the company. If they have any IT positions that they have open, it will say right there in the employment listing, hey, we need somebody who's familiar with this and this and this and this. And it's like, okay, I know they use Teams, they use Salesforce, they use all these applications. So let's go check those DLLs that those applications use and see if there's one we can sideload. We design our malicious DLL, and we use like a vishing attack. Call up somebody, say, hey, this is Trevor from IT. We got to do some updates to Teams because we're having problems with it, and Teams just did a quick security update. We need you to download this update installer and run it. And the update tool basically renames or deletes the original DLL and overwrites it with mine. So I told you we'd talk about Mac OS. What about Mac OS? There's not as rich an arms race with Mac OS. And there's all this debate about which is more secure, Windows, Mac, whatever. The bottom line is Mac just isn't the target of choice. Windows is. But we still do have red teams that we do against Mac OS sometimes. And Mac OS has this thing called the gatekeeper. If you've never used a Mac or you don't much care about Macs, you probably never heard of it. But gatekeeper basically verifies every application that's going to be run. It checks it for signatures, and it checks Apple's database to see if Apple has verified that application as being trusted and trustworthy. And if it doesn't pass both those checks, it doesn't get run. It has a key weakness. It doesn't check AppleScript. That's because AppleScript, by definition, is used to make custom scripts to automate tasks on Mac. And so every AppleScript is going to be unique. And nobody wants to take the time to get Apple to verify every script they make to automate their work. And nobody wants to go through the hassle of signing their Apple scripts. So it trusts launch agents set up by AppleScript. Say I'm a network administrator and I have a lot of Macs on my network and I need to get them all set up with a launch agent to run a particular application at boot up. I'm going to create an AppleScript that's going to run through and automate the process of setting up that launch agent on those Mac OS systems. And Gatekeeper is going to ignore that. So here's our attack scenario. We develop an AppleScript that writes the payload to disk, writes a plist file to disk, which is then used to create a launch agent that starts the malware at startup. We can name it whatever we want. We can name it Zoom. We can name it Teams. We just pick some benign sounding name and we make the launch agent with that name. And then we use social engineering to entice the victim to run the script, whatever pretext we can come up with to get them to actually do that. Phishing works really well here. We're coming to find out lately that phishing is becoming less and less effective. People are catching on to it. They're getting wise because companies have been doing anti-phishing training for years now. They've been caught in their anti-phishing campaigns, you know, the KnowBe4 guys that do the anti-phishing campaigns. People have been caught enough and yelled at by their managers enough that they've gotten really suspicious of phishing. And we have a hard time getting a phishing attack in a red team to be successful. So phishing works really well. You just call them up and say, hey, I need you to do this. If you're convincing enough, they're like, okay, at least one person will run it, and you've got your foothold. See, advantages to this scenario is there's no warning from the gatekeeper because it's AppleScript. And it has built-in persistence. Once you get that launch agent installed, every time they boot the system up, the malware is going to run again, and you're going to get a new callback. So we want to see a demo. We're going to do 2 demos here. How much time I got? 3:11. Oh, we're good. The first demo is against a Windows 10 home system running the home version of Windows Defender. I'll let you make your own mind up about how effective Windows Defender is after you see this demo. I have a whole bunch of different payloads. It's basically a Covenant grunt. There's the default Covenant grunt. There's one with an AMSI bypass. There's one that does only sys calls. It doesn't make any calls to the Windows API. And then there's an app domain. I think there's another one in there. We'll watch on the video. And it's going to be very interesting to see how Defender handles these various versions of the malware. So let me get this going. We'll go full screen. Everybody see that good? All right, first we start. This is Covenant's grunt interface. Whenever I get a callback from an affected system, it'll show up here in this list, and then I can interact with it. Let me get this started. Currently, we have no grunts available to us because we haven't infected any systems yet. Just behind that web browser window where we're looking at Covenant, we have a VM running that Windows 10. And you can see here real quick, Defender is running. It is updated as of October 21st, which was the day I recorded this. It was fully updated, and real-time protection is enabled. And the first thing we're going to run is the default grunt. Nothing has been done to this grunt, except for we've pulled out all mention of Covenant and grunt and stager. The default code has those words in it, and they're signatured. So we've taken those out. And you see right now it bypasses the signature detection, and I get a callback. Very minimal effort. That should give you an opinion about Windows Defender right there. And here I'm just running a simple who am I command. Takes a little bit of time because there's a back and forth between the agent and some lag. And there I know who the user is that I'm logged in as, and I have that connection. Next one I'm going to run, and this is going to be very interesting, is the AMSI bypass. This has an AMSI and event tracing for Windows bypass. That's the only thing I've added to it. Notice that Defender picks it up. Why do you think that is? It caught it right off the bat, although it didn't catch the one that didn't have the bypass. And it did that because Windows Defender has an AMSI bypass signature in it. And it's also very laggy. Usually when it detects something on disk, it'll give you an alert, and then if you try to run it, you'll get another alert. You're going to see here that sometimes you'll get the first alert, but the second alert doesn't come along for another 30, 60 seconds later. Now we're going to run the stageless syscall grunt. This one has only one stage, and it only uses syscalls to talk to the kernel. It doesn't use Windows APIs. So we're going to launch that in a second. There we go. Notice there's been no detection. and we immediately get a callback. We have a new grunt. All right, the next one we're going to launch is the confused syscall grunt. Sometimes if we just do a raw syscall grunt, it'll get detected still, and we have to do some obfuscation, and we'll run it through a confuser. So we confused it, and it still doesn't detect it, and we still get another callback. You're going to understand why I confused the syscall grunt when we do the next demo. The last one we're going to do is the app domain. Remember, this is the mother of all payloads right now. You see the 4 files. The first file there is actually the payload. It's a text file, and you can see the payload is encoded to look like MAC addresses. It's just a file with a list of MAC addresses. You might be familiar with this. And the DLL just loads that file into memory, decodes it from that list of MAC addresses, injects it into memory, and executes it. There's the config file is there to tell it to load the DLL. The SQL logship.exe is a signed, trusted Windows binary. That's what we execute, is the trusted binary. Double click, launches, not a peep out of the antivirus, and in a second, there's our new grunt. So 4 out of the 5 payloads bypassed home version of Windows Defender. Form your own opinions. I'm not going to tell you what to think. All right. The only one that it did detect was the one that had the AMSI bypass because of the signatures. All right, let's go to the next demo. Now this one, we're going to run those same 5 payloads against an enterprise Windows system that is running an enterprise version of Windows Defender and Sentinel-1 Advanced EDR Enterprise System. Sentinel-1 does all the things: signature, behavioral analysis, user land hooking, all of it. It does it. Now, usually the workflow here is Defender gets first dibs. Defender will check it, and then if it doesn't see anything, Sentinel-1 will go crack at it. So here we start out again with an empty grunt list. I don't know why this is pausing like that. It's just sitting there. Going to go open our payloads. First one we're going to try to run is the default grunt. Nothing but a little bit of customizing that's been done to it. We don't even, there we go, let's run it. Double click. I'm slow on this video. Notice the lag. When you have 2 different forms of antivirus running on the system, there's a lot of lag because a lot of things going in the background before it executes. But you see that Windows Defender picked it up this time. I'm not sure if that's picking up on behavior or if that's picking up on signature, but the enterprise version of Windows Defender is much better than the home version of Windows Defender. And we'll go into the history and we'll look at it here. We'll look at all the quarantined items. You'll see 2 detections. It recognizes that it's Covenant. We're going to clear that out so that that list is empty when we run the next one. Next one we're going to run, again, is the one with the AMSI bypass. Now, I have not taken any effort to obfuscate that AMSI bypass. If I had encoded it, this might get past it, but I haven't done that. We execute it, a little bit of a pause. And boom, detected by Windows Defender again. So we'll go in and check the infection list in Windows Defender, check that history. And again, it realizes it's Covenant. Now notice there's only one detection here. There's still one that's got to pop up. It just hasn't come up yet. So we'll clear this and we'll move on. We'll run the next one, which I believe is going to be the syscall, the non-obfuscated syscall grunt. Detected by Defender. Oh no, wait, this is the lag detection from the previous one. This is the AMSI bypass. It's picking up on sending the second alert. That's how laggy Defender can be. You can see that it's the AMSI ETW file that it flagged on. So far we haven't gotten an alert on the syscall one. It's still checking, and now it finally figured it out. So it took a while, but Defender still picked up on the syscalls. Probably some behavioral analysis going on there. Nothing from Sentinel-1 yet because Defender already flagged it and killed it. So now we'll go to the confused one. Same grunt, but this one's been run through a confuser. We'll execute that. This is where it gets interesting. Defender allows this one through, and Sentinel-1 catches it. Now what's happening here is Sentinel-1 has done a behavioral analysis on this binary, and it said, this thing is creating threads and taking virtual memory chunks and writing to them without any calls to NTDLL. That's sus. So it flags it, but notice it doesn't take any action, and it still allows it to run. We still have our window, and in a second, we're still going to get our call back. That sample has probably been sent to Sentinel-1's labs, and they're probably triaging it right now, and there will be a signature for it later. But it never does shut it down. Now, for a red teamer, this is still a fail. We don't want alerts popping up. Something weird's going on. Although I have a working grunt, I don't want the blue team coming and trying to figure out what that alert was. So I got to do something better. Enter the app domain manager, app domain injection payload, which is the next one we're going to run. And I clicked the wrong folder. There's our 4 files like we saw before. We run the SQL log ship binary. Come on, click on it. Let's go. Now there's another late Windows Defender detection. And this one was on the syscall grunt. Took it long enough. All right, let's run SQL log ship.exe, trusted Windows binary. It's going to take a while because now it's got 2 antivirus looking at it, running signature checks, running behavioral analysis. It's got to decode the payload and then inject the payload in memory and run it. So it's going to take a minute for it to execute, but it ran. Not a single warning from either of the 2 EDR systems on the host. And in a second here, it takes a bit. In fact, I had to speed up the video. You'll see the time going by faster. It took a while for it to get that execution running because it was still being analyzed by Sentinel-1. But eventually, no new alerts from Sentinel-1. And finally, we get our grunt. And this is the winner. This is the one that we're going to actually try to get it deployed in the victim environment because this one is invisible to all of their EDR systems. And this one we can operate from for a while. So you see that arms race in action here. So what? What's the take back from this? 2 things that I can think of right off the bat. A, if you're relying on a single antivirus EDR system for all of your endpoint protection, you're in trouble. You've got a blind spot there because red team will always find a way around the latest blue team tactics. Blue team eventually will find a way to detect it, but then we'll find a way around that. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. So have other things in place, log monitoring, correlation engines going, multiple sources of information about what's going on so that if antivirus misses it, you can pick it up somewhere else. 2, red team attacker simulations drive innovation in the security space. Because we do these engagements, it causes antivirus vendors in desperation to develop new methods of detecting our tactics. And we can maybe stay a little bit ahead of the bad guys, because they're doing all the same stuff. They're figuring this stuff out too. They just don't tell anybody about it. They don't go and broadcast the world, hey, we found this great way to bypass antivirus. They just keep it to themselves. So we get shut down by the blue team guys. We get frustrated. We go back to the drawing board, do our research, and figure out how to get around their defenses. We get past them for a year or so. They get frustrated. They do the research on how to build a better antivirus. And this goes back and forth and back and forth. And we have a lot of fun with it. I don't know how fun it is for them, but we have a lot of fun with it. And it drives innovation. It improves security for everybody. Oops. So, who wants to hear a story? I don't know if we have time. I'll just tell you this. In my last red team, we used that app domain injection payload, and it was a assumed breach, so we got it on a foothold host that had no AV on it. They just kind of put us in there. We operated for days, getting control of systems in their network for days. They never saw a thing, and the other systems we were getting control of had one of the most sophisticated and robust anti-malware systems that we've come up against. It's a constant thorn in our side. We completely bypassed it. Until one day, we tried to impersonate the wrong Kerberos ticket, and an alert popped up. And they went to triage, and it led them straight to that SQL log ship.exe. And they grabbed it, they sent it off to the AV vendor's lab to look at, and they sent it back and said, oh, it's a false positive. Because it's a trusted signed Windows binary. And they sent it back. Well, my point of contact knew it was malware, so he sent it back to him and said, look again. 3 times they sent it back as a false positive. That's how good that attack works right now. Eventually, they figured it out later on, like a week later. They figured out something's going up with this SQL log ship, and they started looking closer at the file system, and they found those other files. And they found that MAC-encoded copy of the implant. They didn't know what they were looking at. They knew it was weird, but they figured something malicious is going on. We knew the jig was up because we lost one of our implants, so we very quickly wrote a new one using a completely different trusted Windows binary, put it on one of the systems we already controlled, erased every trace of the original one, and just laid low until they finished their triaging. They found all the other systems we had a foothold on, removed the SQL log ship and all the stuff associated with it, cleaned them up, and put them back in, but we still had the foothold on this one host with a different binary. And once they stopped looking, we went back to work again. And they had no idea we were still, until the end of the engagement, they had no idea we were still in their network. That's how good that particular attack works. There's some links to the things we talked about. Neo Confuser X is the confuser we use on our payloads. Links to Covenant and Mythic. Some papers on bypassing userland hooking, app domain injection, DLL side loading. I think these slides are going to be made available to the attendees, so you can get those from there. Oops, didn't mean to click on that. And there's my email address if you have questions. I'm going to go ahead and make my way toward the back if you have questions, so the next presenter can come up and start getting ready. And I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.